What is up, everybody? It's Alex from Heavy New York calling from the quarantine zone again, and this time we got Dirk of Megadeth and Cadaver. Thank you so much for your time today, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. It's so awesome to have you here. We have the new Cadaver album scheduled to come out this November, Eder and Bile. I actually got to speak to Anders a couple months ago about like the making of this record and the idea for it. So for you, how was the experience and the overall making of this album?
Well, Alex, I mean, it was a ton of fun because the way we ended up doing it is that Anders came over here to LA where I live, and so we recorded in a studio that I co-own with Adair Dalfenbach, who produced the album, who's a good friend of ours and an amazing engineer and producer. And so we basically just did it the way it was done back when Cadaver started out, which is just jamming together. So Anders on guitar, me on drums, and we just banged out the songs really, and until we had good takes of them, so there wasn't any it wasn't the typical recording drums separately, etc. It was really a jam more than anything, and so some of the songs would evolve as we did that because we'd be like, oh, maybe this part could be more like this or whatever. So and then we just kind of felt out the tempos and the vibe of the song until we were happy. So for me, it was really fun because it's not often nowadays that recordings are done this way, and I really wanted to have that kind of spirit for this record and for Cadaver specifically.
Yeah, I thought that this album sounded very organic. So from what you're telling me, it sounds like the recording process and the songwriting and really just the overall making of this album was a fairly organic process, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean that word right there, organic. That's kind of it kind of defines to me what old school death metal and thrash metal and grindcore, etc. is. Black metal, it's something that if you polish it too much, I mean, it can be good for some bands and in certain cases, but other times you kind of lose some of the grit and the and the intention that comes with when songs are played by humans, not computers, right?
Yeah.
So as much as I understand, and like I said, modern production values can be really great and can be super helpful sometimes, but when it comes to a band like Cadaver that I grew up listening to as a teenager, the way I see their band is just raw and, kind of almost out of control. You know what I mean? It's like, it's almost like you're reaching maximum speed on your race car and it's about to fall apart kind of thing.
Definitely. I feel like organic metal is just another subgenre at this point. Like you have your death metal, your black metal, your thrash metal. They're just going to have to make an all organic subgenre like in a grocery store.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say the vegans like myself would love that.
It's funny, too, and correct me if I'm wrong, too, but this is your first contribution to Cadaver, or your first full-length album contribution?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
Okay, so when you joined up with Anders to create this album, were you kind of looking at the earlier material such as In Pains or Necrosis and being like, okay, this is how I have to play, or were you allowed to kind of bring a little bit of your own mix into Cadaver?
I mean, it was very open in the sense that, the songs came together the way they did, and I think we never really spoke about, we need to bring in this or that element. It just kind of happened the way it did. And as I said before, Cadaver, I grew up listening to them. I saw the band live, actually, for when they were touring under Cadaver Inc., so in the early 2000s, late 90s. I can't remember exactly the date, but and even before that, I mean, the first time I heard them was Hallucinating Anxiety. So the band's always been kind of part of my musical landscape and part of, making me who I am today, like so many bands from the early days. Yeah. So I think I, naturally had, a feeling about how I should, contribute to the music, how I should approach the drums, and we worked together on the song structure. So Anders, of course, wrote the music, but I would come back to him and, suggest changes in structures or adding parts or changing parts. So it was just, very open.
Did it almost feel kind of like a good throwback in a way? Because playing with, bands that, I mean, a lot of the later stuff that you've collaborated with Soilwork or Megadeth, which is a little bit more melodic, but, also playing with bands like Scarve and Aborted and stuff like that, did it almost feel kind of like a good throwback in a way?
Yeah, in a way, I mean, with Soilwork, I would say on the last couple albums I did with them, we were definitely also, integrating more of that kind of death metal ferocity, at least on certain tracks. But yeah, I've always been a huge fan of music that's just balls to the wall extreme, and so so I definitely kind of got to scratch that itch with Cadaver, and with Anders it's super fun because neither of us take it deadly seriously. So the whole experience was a lot of laughing and a lot of joking, and at the same time just giving it our all when we were on our instruments. So yeah, I would say it's definitely a little bit of that, and I already look forward to the next stuff, which we've actually already started working on. So.
Oh wow, you're already going into it.
Yep.
Wow. Well, thank you for keeping us, giving us that fulfillment that we need for this quarantine time. We need some angry music at this time, so thank you for keeping it coming.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think we're all in the same place, and for me, this kind of music has, of course, always been a way to kind of express things that I maybe didn't want to express, face to face with somebody because it might not be a good exchange. So it's good to have the drums to kind of let loose and this kind of music. I think that's always been sort of the purpose of it in a way, at least for me,
Yeah.
from when I was a teenager with the typical teenage angst and all the things that happen when you're young and you're kind of trying to figure things out. Up till now, because yeah, like you said, especially in this situation we're all in right now. I mean, there's so many things that we want that aren't around. So luckily we have music, and luckily we can express ourselves in there and put all our frustration and rage and whatever thoughts we might have in there.
Yeah, I know a couple drummers who are putting like certain people who I choose not to name on their snare and their toms and everything like that, and just hitting really hard on it. So.
Exactly. Sometimes that's what you need, man.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason why every drummer I've interviewed is always like the most laid back member of the band and the most chill member. And I think I know why. It's because they are able to let out everything they got on their instrument.
You have a point. I mean, it's like sports, really. I often compare it with my drum students, when I'm trying to show them like that, for example, building up speed or building up endurance and stuff, which are questions I get a lot. That's like sports. That's what I tell them because it's really physically demanding. You need to be perseverant and just making that happen over time, because a lot of that stuff doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take years and years, and you never get to a point where you can let go. Like if I stop playing for a month tomorrow, the next few weeks are going to be super tough getting back behind the kid, and I'm very aware of that because it's happened. So I try to always play, and yeah, for me, it's kind of like my workout, and yeah, maybe that is why we're also chill.
Yeah, I feel like drums are like, because there's times where like a guitar player or a bass player, like they put their instrument down for sometimes weeks or months at a time, but then they pick it up again. It's not too hard to get back into the groove. But like if you take a break from drumming, it can actually like physically like alter the way you play.
Absolutely, yeah, and especially I would say the older you get too, because when I was 20, I didn't really have to worry too much about that, and to be honest, I was playing all the time anyway. But now it's like it's a bit more. It takes a bit more to stay on top of things, but that's good because you develop routines. At least I do. I develop routines that keep me on top of my game, and even when sometimes life takes over and I can't play as much as I'd like to, those routines allow me to get back to it quickly. And I think that's really important because, for example, with Cadaver, we played one show last year, so this was before the quarantine at the end of the summer of 2019, and it was the one show at a festival in Norway, and I was super stoked to do it, but I basically, spent 3 or 4 weeks just prepping for the one show, getting in shape to be able to play a full Cadaver set with, songs spanning all the records. So that's what it takes with this kind of music.
Yeah, and I'd imagine like you got to practice a lot more. Like I know shows can't happen right now, but you gotta pretty much play as much right now as if you're touring to prepare for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and because we know at one point it's all of a sudden going to come back, and that's not when you want to start thinking about this issue.
Yeah. What's interesting is has working with Cadaver and, working with a band who you've clearly admired for so long, has that also broadened your horizons and opened your ideas to new elements that maybe you could bring into Megadeth or to bring into other projects as well?
I mean, I'm sure in some way it has, because for me, like, I'm just a passionate about music in general. Like for example, this morning I was listening to Dave Brubeck Quartet, some jazz albums from the late '50s, and then I listened to the latest Midnight record, and so I'm all over the map when it comes to music, and it's kind of always been that way since I was a kid. To be honest with you, I mean, my parents were hugely into classical music, also into rock and pop, so that stuff was always around, and from when I was really young. I mean, I started playing violin when I was 6, and I pursued that for a number of years, and so it's always been, for me, I just, as much as I'm a metal fan and I'm a huge, death metal grindcore addict and stuff, but I also need things to change up and I need variation, and so when it comes to like mingling influences and taking them to different parts and stuff, I think that just happens naturally. It's something that I don't even really have to think about.
Yeah.
Like when I approached the Megadeth recording, for example, which happened earlier this year for me on drums and together with David Ellefson. I mean, it's just you go into a certain zone and you know what a band like Megadeth needs. At least I do, because it's also a band I've listened to since forever, and I had the chance to tour with the band obviously since 2016, so that's really given me a good, I think, perspective on how to approach that recording and the creation of those parts.
Yeah, like, and what it's cool, I've noticed that drummers also have a real open-minded taste of music because, like, again, I'm not talking shit or, discrediting metal singers or guitar players, but with guitar playing or metal, there is kind of like, there's a certain sound effect that you have to achieve. There's a certain, style that you have to achieve. But, like, I feel like whether you're listening to smooth jazz or you're listening to grindcore, in the end, drums always have the same purpose, and that's keeping the rhythm and keeping the beat together. So I'd imagine that, with everything that you've collaborated on, from Cadaver to Megadeth to Soilwork to Aborted and Scarve and all the bands you've played with, that, like, I'd imagine that there is sort of like a similar methodology that ties everything together, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is, and a lot of it is about, for me, over time, a lot of that is about finding your place in the music, knowing when, it's okay to go nuts, and knowing when you're just playing a kind of a supporting role, like kind of being the linebacker of the song, and I mean, and that's something that you're always learning about. Every new band, every new project is a different approach, right? And that's why I enjoy doing session work, and that's why I enjoy working with different people, because not only does it keep me excited, it also keeps me, from becoming stale and repeating myself, and which is the most, frustrating thing as a drummer. I remember feeling it when I first started out. I picked up the drums, I was about 15 years old, and the first 2 years I was just kind of jamming by myself, playing along to records. And after a few years, it was fun, but I reached a point where I was like, okay, what else can I do? Like, I was stuck, So that's when, luckily, after high school, my parents, sent me off to a music school, and I got to really learn about not just playing, like, along to Napalm Death or Terrorizer or whatever, but, just kind of really broadening my horizon as to what is possible on drums. And I'm still living off of that today, because, I mean, I've studied jazz, I've studied Latin music, Afro-Cuban stuff. I mean, and there's so much to learn, even if you're never, I'll probably never be in a jazz band, maybe when I'm older, who knows, but I don't feel like I have the capability to really do something like that, if you know what I mean. But studying the techniques and the way it's approached and listening to the records, you just pick things up that are going to inform everything else. So yeah, for me, being open-minded, it's a natural thing, but it's also, I think, key to developing your own style and personality as a player.
Yeah. As a drummer, have you always needed the music to lay down the rhythm and lay down the beat, or has there ever been a time that you've had a whole drum pattern written and that maybe that helped the band write over that?
No, it happens both ways all the time. For example, you mentioned Scarve, my first band. It happened many times there that I would come up with a beat that would then, get the other guys to come up with a riff that went with that beat and that turned into a song. Like, one example that comes to mind is the song Asphyxiate from the Irradiant album, which started on drums. And there's more, I forgot. But, it's like we always were working each individually on ideas, and then we would come together and we would jam them out. And when the magic hits, when things happen and everybody locks in, it doesn't matter which instrument started it. So for me, I've always been somebody who was able to, conjure music in my head somehow and play along to it. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting you mentioned this, because my band C, which is my grindcore band that I'm, been currently working on a lot, we're preparing an album releasing some other songs online as well. And that's a band where, I pretty much write all the music. I play drums, also guitar, but I start everything on drums. So every song that's ever been written for Band C, apart from a few covers that I did, I just started by just, basically blasting something out behind my kit and, basically improvising some kind of song structure. And then I would put that away and then later on pick up my guitar and turn it into a song. So maybe it's because I'm a drummer first and foremost, but I think it's a really fun way of writing because I don't know, maybe at the time when I'm playing those drum parts, I have some kind of riffs in my head, but by the time I pick up my guitar and work on it, I completely forgot what those were. So it's kind of like, at that point I have a template there that I can go either which way with, and it's a lot of fun. And usually in a few hours I have a song, because I really like the spontaneous, raw energy of grindcore specifically. And so I'm kind of striving to keep that, the process of making demos and writing songs and stuff like most bands do. Sometimes for me, it drains me of my enthusiasm for the material when it goes on too long and I hear them too many times because I just get bored of it. So I try to, that's the way my mind works. I don't know, but I try to just keep it fresh and interesting even for myself. So by the time the song skeleton or whatever the basic song is ready, I'm still excited about it.
Yeah. And you can answer this totally honestly. We're not hiding anything. If you don't write the drums first and, the band has like a song already written with like riffs and stuff and they present it to you, how off time is it sometimes?
Well, nowadays not so much, because nowadays everybody knows how to use, Superior Drummer or Easy Drummer or whatever. So most people send me stuff that already has, more or less developed drums to it. So it still happens, that things are off and then I have to point it out or we have to figure out a way to make it work. But I think now, with those tools, it's really helped a lot of bands, even established bands, to make their writing process more fun and easy, and they can kind of have a more clear idea of what they want versus, I remember in the early Scarf days, it was like, when all you had was the shitty boombox to record yourself in a rehearsal space where you already couldn't hear much of anything in the first place. It was kind of tough sometimes to get your ideas down.
Yeah. And like, it's funny too, because I feel like with like the art of drumming, do you almost, when you're playing material live, do you almost like execute it exactly like how you recorded it? Or when you're playing drums in the live presence, you can maybe, hit the crash cymbal here instead of the ride cymbal, or maybe you could, give a couple extra beats or up the tempo a little bit. Do you sometimes change, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no way that like you play beat for beat for beat exactly how it was originally recorded live, right?
Well, it really depends. It depends on the situation. For example, with Megadeth, it got to the point where, Dave asked me to go back to all the songs, and he sent me like a bunch of the only drums from the classic records and stuff, and to really get every detail right. So those songs I played pretty much, I'd say 95% or something the way they were, because that's what people want to hear, and that's the way I want to hear them. And so that's not so much about me, like, adding or changing things. And in the same way, when Scarf, Scarf was around, which is, mid-90s or early 90s to mid-2000s, roughly, we would rehearse 4 or 5 times a week. Sylvain, Patrick, and myself mostly, the 2 guitar players and myself. And so we would rehearse so much that by the time I went into the studio, my drum parts were perfectly figured out for the most part, especially on the earlier albums. And then, we would play it live, I would just know them. So yeah, they were pretty much note by note. But I got bored of that because, as I said earlier, that whole process of spending so much time on material, by the time sometimes even I'd go in the studio to record stuff, I'd be sick of it, and my enthusiasm wouldn't be there as much. And of course you can conjure some of it, but it's more fun when it's just naturally there. So at some point, I think this probably happened, after the second Scarf album, going into Irradiant, I decided that I wanted to leave more open space for whatever's going to happen when I record. So I wouldn't define everything as clearly. And then that kind of set me on a trail of just including improvisation a lot more in music, And so nowadays when I record, a lot of times I record stuff and I have no idea what I'm going to do. I just, kind of figure out what the song needs. If I always have this conversation with whoever I'm recording for, like, hey, do you want me to stick closely to some of these demo drums? Do you want me to do whatever I want? So depending on the project, there's more or less freedom, but I always improvised a lot. And so now what happens is when I have to play some of that stuff, like for a drum playthrough or, in the case of Cadaver, like for a live show, I have to go back and figure out what the hell I played because I forgot.
Do you find it like sometimes easier to come up with new ideas or figure out how to play when you're with the company of other bandmates, or do you prefer to sometimes be alone in the studio where there's nothing between you and the instrument?
The best for me is alone, actually, a lot of times, with the exception of like how we did it with Anders for the Cadaver album, where we play together, because then it's a different thing. Then there's like real live interaction. But when it's the typical setting where I record drums by myself, usually what I'll do is I'll do a few playthroughs with the riffs and whatever scratch guitar or whatever there is, and then a lot of times I'll tell oftentimes Adair, who I record with, or whoever and the engineer is, like, just turn off the guitars, just me and the click track, and I'm just gonna play it by myself now, because at that point I know the song, I can hum it in my head or whatever I do. I don't know exactly, but I know what the song is, and so I can really focus on the drums being 100%. And that works the best for me. I always find it a little bit distracting to play to pre-recorded guitars, even as well as they're played. Somehow I lose a little bit of the feeling and the precision that I can get when I'm just purely listening to drums.
Mm-hmm. Being that you're always behind the kit, though, because when I interview a front man or a guitar player or a bass player, I ask them like how different it is playing live versus in the studio, because there's crowd interaction and there's stage presence and moving around. But being that you're behind the kit, is it fairly similar playing live as when you're in like the studio or in a practice space, or even still for drumming, playing live is a completely separate art than recording?
I would say it's completely separate for two reasons. First of all, the endurance thing is a lot more pronounced live because, yes, I move more. There's not many breaks. Like, for example, with Megadeth, we have very few breaks. It's like go, 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 go. Dave does not like pauses between songs, so it's like we just go. And so it becomes a real workout stamina-wise, which in the studio you don't have to do. In the studio, you can stop whenever you want and pick it back up. If you're like halfway through a take and you're like, oof, I'm getting tired, you just stop and you can pick it back up there. You can do another take until you're warmed up or whatever. So it's much easier physically, I would say. And then the other thing is, just the performance, which is something that I've really stepped up with Megadeth, obviously, because it's something that I had already kind of started working on with Soilwork, kind of having a little bit more stage presence, getting up from behind my kit, making some moves and stuff. But a lot of the Soilwork material, being that I wrote my own drum parts, tend to be very busy. So there often wasn't that much room for me to do anything than just playing the drums. And with Megadeth, not only is there more room for that, but also if you look at some of the classic drummers that they had, like Nick Menza especially, comes to mind. He had a great stage presence. He was part of getting people excited, and so being a huge fan of the band first and foremost, I wanted to honor that legacy and also bring that aspect to the live shows. And so I really stepped up, moving, raising my hand, standing up, having interaction with the other band members at key points in the show, because it's part of what makes a show fun to watch.
Yeah, I've noticed that actually, because I saw you play with Soilwork 3 times. One of them was on the tour you did with Soulfly in 2015, and then I saw you twice on the Demanufacture anniversary tour. And I've noticed, like, you have been looking out into the audience, and sometimes people are a little robotic behind the kit, or sometimes you don't even see the person behind the kit. You only see the cymbals moving from watching from the barricade. I've noticed that you actually do interact with the crowd very well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important, because as a fan, I go to a lot of shows still. I always have, my wife and I see tons of shows when, obviously now there aren't any, but usually. And it's what I enjoy. I love it when, another person that comes to mind as an example is Dave Lombardo. He's always had a great crowd interaction. I've seen him with various different bands. I've seen him with Grip Inc., with Phantom House, obviously with Slayer and stuff. And he's always been, even though his parts are pretty busy, now it's Suicidal, he's always so fun to watch, because there's just a lot of excitement happening. And he's not just, like you said, kind of robotic behind the kid just playing his parts, because at that point it's kind of like I can put on the album, so that's how I approach it now, and I'm glad you've noticed it, because I think it's an extra thing that you have to learn. You have to kind of, for me, I had to come out of my shell, because it's very easy to be hidden behind, like you said, your cymbals and your stands, and you're kind of at the back anyway, so you can very easily hide and be like, I'll let the other guys on stage take care of the crowd interaction. But at some point I was like, okay, I'm better than that, I can do more. So that's my approach now.
Yeah, do you have like dolls set up in front of your drum kit to like pretend to interact with?
No, but I'll tell you, when Megadeth is about to go play, and we haven't toured for a while or whatever, I will go to my drum room and practice all my moves, because just to refresh my memory, and also just because, again, it's another physical aspect that comes into play, right? So you got to be prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Stage presence, I feel like it's one of those things where there is part of there is obviously, you could practice at it and you can get better at it. But then there's also an essence of stage presence where like sometimes it just comes out of nowhere, where you can't rehearse for it or you can't practice it. It just sparks. Like there's a pinnacle moment in the live presence where, okay, I'm comfortable on stage. These are my people. I can interact with them.
Definitely, and there's definitely some of that. You can never translate that feeling of being on stage in any other situation, I don't think so. So that's always a big motivator, and of course, especially with Megadeth, we always have fantastic crowds and huge crowds for the most part and stuff. So that's, that makes it easier. But I think it depends on personalities too, right? Because some people who have a really outgoing, extroverted personality can probably, start having stage presence from the moment they play. And for me, being more of an introverted person, naturally, it's something I have to work on and learn. But that's cool because, like I said, it helped me come out of my shell and helped me be more confident as a player.
Absolutely. And the final question I wanted to ask you regarding Cadaver is obviously you mentioned that you're working on some new music right now, even before Eder and Bile sees the light of day for the future. Could maybe Eder and Bile serve as like a clear representation of what the future of Cadaver is going to sound like? Or being that, the music is very organic and you guys really aren't afraid to push boundaries, maybe you'll experiment a little bit further?
Yeah, that's a great question. Here's the way I look at it. If you look at every Cadaver album, they're all pretty different. Like In Pain's, being the second record after Hallucinating Anxiety, I remember at the time I was almost like, is this the same band? So that's how drastic it was. And without saying it'll be that drastic, I know that Anders and I have talked about, just going where the music takes us. And if that means it's going to be more experimental or more diverse, or that there's going to be things on there that maybe, wouldn't have fit on Eder and Bile, then that's cool. Ultimately, we just do what we feel. And we have a bunch of stuff that we're working on that's sounding really, really good. And we also have Eilert, who was the bass player on In Pains. He's been with the band recently, so I'm guessing he's probably going to be a part of the record. He plays stand-up bass, so that's a really cool additional element, so from a duo to a trio kind of. And so yeah, man, I can't really say yet like exactly what it's going to sound like. It's too early stages, but it's definitely going to be exciting, that much I know.
Maybe some gentle ballads for the next one?
Yeah, some gentle ballads about death, maybe.
Hey, stranger things have been done.
That's true.
Yeah, there are a couple of death metal love songs that I could easily see people, I saw Goat Whore play at a wedding one time, so.
Nice. Wow.
Yep.
That is pretty epic.
Yeah, but, and the bride just punching people in the face, that's a sight that I'll never forget.
That is, that's not your typical wedding. I love it.
Absolutely. So before we go, again, thank you so much for your time today, Dirk. Is there just anything else with Cadaver or Megadeth or any of the other projects that you're in that you would like to promote in terms of new music? Obviously, thanks to a certain virus that shall not be named, shows aren't happening at the moment, but obviously we'll be seeing you on the road quite a bit with multiple bands, right?
Yes. Well, the Megadeth album hopefully will be out at some point in the spring. We'll see. It's not confirmed or anything, but I'm hoping personally that that's going to happen. Followed by some tours if, like you said, the virus is a bit more, toned down. And obviously really looking forward to the Cadaver release. There's also the Brave the Cold album, which is coming out or is already streaming, I believe. So it's a band I'm doing with Mitch Harris. And then, I have my own stuff with Ben C. We're working on the record. It's currently being mixed, so I'm really looking forward to putting that out because that's really my 100% my musical expression. So that's going to be a lot of fun to put out. And yeah, man, I mean, always a lot of stuff going on, and that's how I like it.
Typical drummer syndrome. Always, I've yet to interview one drummer that just plays in one band, ever.
Well, I mean, if you have the chance to work with people you enjoy and if you have a lot of music in you, then why not let it out?
Exactly. And hey, it's always good to be busy, especially at this time.
For sure, man. For sure.
Yeah. But thank you so much, Dirk. Everybody, we are here with Dirk of Megadeth and Cadaver. Be sure to pick up the new Cadaver album coming out this November, Eder and Bile, out on Nuclear Blast. Pick it up then when supplies last forever. We will see you next time on Heavy New York.